Thank you for joining us again and welcome back to Edusplorer. In this episode, I will be looking into the reason why the recent decision by G7 members to use $50 billion as loan to Ukraine from Russian assets is a fundamental error. This will go a long way to increase distrust among relationship among European countries and Russia, where things are already tense at the moment. But more importantly, but to African leaders and also officials who feel their geopolitical partners may have their interests in mind, this is a strong message to you. If you collect your assets and also invest it into Western countries and in foreign banks, it might to an extent when you go against the rules and regulations, or you put your interests first, which is important for your own country, it may be interpreted differently and you may find yourself in the situation in Russia. I'm not saying that what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, I am not an expert in that part, but I'm talking about the continent of Africa's perspective and interaction with the global community. It is important for African countries to sit back a little bit and observe things from a distance, as we all seeing what's happening in the Sahel region, as those nations are severing ties between France and also the United States of America. This relationship is at the worst level as it can ever been in years. If you look at this particular issue, we have enough to dive into how she struggles to explain the basics with regards to this particular decision by G7 countries. More importantly, we will dive into the continent of Africa, why one of Africa's country which is very influential in international politics to an extent, who is a darling of the United States of America and also criticized Russia during the invasion, came out strongly and lashed out with regards to these fundamental failures in geopolitical decision making with regards to Russia and Ukraine.
The unilateral appropriation of Russia's assets is equally unlawful, unacceptable, and a derogation from the UN Charter.
We will look into that in some specifics, but let's start this video with our friends at the GWTV, the German television station, and we will come into perspective in a moment.
The U.S. and Ukraine have signed a 10-year bilateral security agreement on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the pact would protect not just his country, but the world from Russian aggression. The G7 leaders also backed a multi-billion-dollar deal to use frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine strengthen its defenses and pay for reconstruction. We have our chief political correspondent, Nina Haza, in Bari, Italy, reporting for us. Nina, give us the latest from the G7 summit on what you're hearing about this $50 billion loan.
Well, Claire, this is being hailed as a big success all around. We heard that in the report. And it is something where the G7 think that they found a very good solution for the question that they've been asking themselves for a very long time now. How can we give more flexibility in terms of financial flexibility to Ukraine and fast? How can we support them considerably? And so now the idea is to have $50 billion worth of a loan that the G7 countries would take out from the banks and then give that money to Ukraine. So once all those details are being spelled out by the country's finance ministers, Ukraine will have access to that money, and then the loan would be paid back by the proceeds from those frozen Russian assets. And here, this is also a political message that the G7 want to send to Vladimir Putin to say, we have a Trump-proof mechanism here at play. That is something, it doesn't matter whether any of us get thrown out of office, whether Joe Biden has to make space for Donald Trump, for example, in the US, or whether any of the G7 countries find themselves struggling financially, Ukraine still has a lot of money that it can use.
Let's put this into context, as you've heard the GWTV journalist clearly explain there. But from my own understanding, this is not a message to just Russia alone. It's a clear message to Western geopolitical partners that we can do the same to you and what we are doing to Russia. It is a message to the continent of Africa, to South Africa, Ghana, and also the Western African countries who were recently kicked out France from their particular country and region. It is a message to the Middle Eastern partners like Qatar, the UAE, and also Asian partners who are investing and also getting into business with regards to their Western partner. It's pretty clear with regards to geopolitics. Like I've said, any country that does not understand the geoeconomics in the modern era will not understand how to move ahead with strategic policies that are important for their own people. As a clear example, if you make a decision in whatever shape or form that benefits your own people in other areas, or it could be a conflict of interest, then the most easiest option at the time when all options have been put on the table and nothing is working, it will be your assets that are in the banks and also which you can access them. So this is a clear indication that this option is a message sent to the geopolitical partners, specifically in the continent of Africa, who should understand that some of their decisions they are making at the moment may come to a level of where they would have to pay the price in different areas. Despite all of this perspective, even German analysts see this from a different angles, that there might be some positive and some negative. When a question with regards to the Russian asset being used was posed to a German analyst, she struggled to explain the balance with regards to why this could involve some element of distrust, not just from Russia's perspective, but from global investment partners by the DW journalist. Let's dive into that in a moment, and we will go back to what the Kenyan president actually said with regards to this particular situation in the G7 summit in Italy.
Now let's get a little bit into the details, if I may. Some who are watching this are probably asking, why is this just the interest? Why wasn't it possible to just hand over frozen Russian assets to Ukraine? Would that have also been an option available?
Well, this topic was pushed a lot by the United States, but there had been disagreement between European countries and the United States. The majority of the issue of the asset is in Europe. The problem is that these are legal concerns. We cannot just seize Russian assets. This would be illegal. And this is why European countries were so hesitant to do that. And this is why we have this kind of compromise that was taken to use the interests on the profits of frozen central bank assets. And this is something where the European countries can go with.
So seizing the assets would have been illegal. Looking at this decision to just make the interest available, I'm wondering whether you think this step alone could perhaps deepen distrust that you see particularly among some countries in the global south, that the West is weaponizing the financial system.
This is a question that needs to be considered very carefully, and this is also why it was decided not to use the assets, because the banking system was seen as something that is neutral, that cannot be weaponized, and this is why we have this kind of compromise that we only use the interest on the profits as collateral, but the danger is there.
And you think that will put minds at ease that it's just the interest that's being used?
I think it's a very good compromise. I'm not sure it will ease all the minds, but I think it's the best that we can have, and it's important that we have this kind of agreement for the Ukraine.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about rebuilding. We know Ukraine's recovery costs have risen to 486 billion euros, according to the World Bank, and we are now only talking about deals addressing a fraction of that. Where is money going to come from to help rebuild Ukraine?
You mean coming from this loan? And then we have also individual countries supporting the Ukraine. We had in Berlin the Ukraine Recovery Conference. So countries are really trying to figure out how to support the Ukraine. But it's important that G7 as a group also gives this kind of loan.
Okay. I want to turn now to the G7 generally. We're seeing an increasingly unstable, fragile, insecure world. Do you think formats like the G7, with these world leaders meeting together in Italy, are the best way to deal with these pressing global problems?
The G7, the G7 is an important forum. We live in a geo-economic world. We see more and more fragmentation, and the G7 is a group of like-minded countries that share common goals and values. So these are democratic countries. These are countries that have market economies, and they share these goals and they want to support the Ukraine. So it's important that the G7 come together. But as you mentioned, we do have global problems that G7 itself cannot solve anymore. And therefore, we need a lot of outreach. Italy invited a lot of countries to join the summit. We also need other forums. We still have the G20, we have international organizations. So G7 cannot solve everything, but if this group is united and can send a strong signal to conflict or to global problems, this is already important.
So, as the German analyst clearly indicated there, if you understand what geopolitics and how it works and geoeconomics in the modern era, you will understand that Europe is divided with regards to the decision to use Russian assets. When you understand how this actually works, Europe can make those decisions itself. It's being pushed by the United States of America. As the US is leading the foreign policy, Europe doesn't really have a solid foreign policy for its own self and how it can tackle issues like this and make fundamental decisions, whether in the Ukraine or in Israel or in the Sudan or in different parts or even across different regions around the world. The European foreign policy is shaky, and their decision-making process, especially with regards to the Russian war in Ukraine, is being influenced by the United States of America. That's why you see countries like France, despite its failures in the Sahel region in the continent of Africa, they are coming strong to champion the security in Europe. That's why the French President Emmanuel Macron has gone out of his way to make some fundamental errors and misstatements with regards to Russia's relationship, talking about troops, talking about why Europe to seize its security and stand firm. These are some of the reasons. That's why, from what you heard from the analyst, Europe is divided with regards to this decision, and as a rule of law, as she pointed out, there are a number of things that need to be taken into consideration while going through this aspect. However, the continent of Africa is watching closely and the Middle Eastern partners are watching closely. This message can still be related to you. It's just that it's being pushed towards Russia at the moment. That's the reason why, despite his recent visit to the country of the United States of America, the Kenyan president, as we all know, came out strong to point out that legally, despite the Kenyan opposition with regards to Russian war in Ukraine, the Kenyan leader has come out clear to shock its geopolitical partners in Italy and actually said this.
Kenya's position has been clear and unequivocal from the beginning. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is unlawful, unjust, and a violation of the fundamental principles of international law, which honor the sovereign equality of nations, upholds their territorial integrity, and advocates the peaceful resolution of all disagreements. Just like the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East has been equally devastating. So is the case with the war in the Sahel region in Africa, in Eastern DRC, in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, and of course in the Sudan. 40 million Africans have been displaced by the war in our continent, and 2.5 million kids are out of school. This state of affairs speaks volumes of global leadership, and especially the peace architecture at the United Nations, and more specifically the gridlock at the United Nations Security Council. Let me also say this peace summit is a historic step in the right direction. For the first time, we have convened to talk about peace in Ukraine and not war in Ukraine. Secondly, a commitment to peace makes certain fundamental concessions inevitable. This summit should not be a meeting of just friends. This should be a meeting of both friends and foe. To succeed in this positive trajectory, Russia must be on the table, number one. Number two, an American general, Norman Swartzfeld, said, the more we sweat in peace, the less we bleed in war. It is time for leaders of the world to talk about peace, negotiate peace, work hard to build peace, and configure a global strategic framework that integrates peace as the sole means and end of human endeavor. Finally, we have gathered here and we are reminded by the Indian statesman Mahatma Gandhi, who said that an eye for an eye will make humanity blind. Just as Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unlawful and unacceptable, the unilateral appropriation of Russia's assets is equally unlawful, unacceptable, and a derogation from the UN Charter, especially for those of us who believe in freedom, justice, and democracy, and the rule of law. As we embark on this journey to resolve conflict in Ukraine and throughout the world, it's time for parties to the war in Ukraine to demonstrate good faith, abandon intransigent attitudes, and soften their positions. I thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank you for watching. Hopefully we've informed you in regards to the reason why the current weaponizing of the banking system and also relationship to Russia-Ukraine war by the G7 members is causing a lot of friction in the geopolitical circle, and why African nations should monitor this carefully, and this may be used against them in the future. Who knows? As with regards to decisions being made by most African nations in the Sahel in particular, they should be careful on how they carry out their interactions and making those decisions. We want to thank you for watching. If you are new to our channel, we encourage you to check some of our informative videos on this YouTube channel. Keep the conversation going. Give us a like. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.